Have you ever wondered what someone would say if they knew their time was almost up? What words could carry the weight of life and death? Rob Reiner, the legendary filmmaker, actor, and activist, spoke to his daughter Tracy Reiner in what would become the final conversation of his life. A conversation filled with urgency, fear, and an almost unimaginable warning. If you've ever thought that family is always safe, that trust is unbreakable, then this story will make you question everything. Because what happened inside the Reiner estate in Brentwood wasn't just a tragedy. It was a revelation, a cautionary tale, and a heartbreak all at once. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The Reiner family, known for their larger-than-life presence in Hollywood, seemed untouchable. Rob Reiner, at 78, had built a career that spanned decades, creating some of the most iconic films in cinematic history. From comedies that made us laugh to dramas that moved us to tears, his legacy was untarnished, or so the public believed. Michelle Reiner, his wife of decades, was a private yet formidable presence, known for her elegance and dedication to the family. Together, they were the epitome of Hollywood royalty, admired, respected, and envied. Their children, Tracy, Romy, and Nick, were raised under the protective shadow of this empire, each one living in the glow of privilege and promise. But the truth, the hidden reality behind the mansion gates, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. On a Sunday that would become infamous, tragedy struck the Reiner household. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed to death at their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The details are chilling. A son, Nick, 32, living in the guest house on the property, was arrested the very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. It was a scene that stunned not just Hollywood, but the entire world. How could such violence erupt in a family that appeared so perfect, so untouchable? And what led to the final warning Rob Reiner gave to his daughter, Tracy? Those words, spoken in the quiet desperation of a parent who senses danger, now haunt the story like a ghost. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? He said it as if he knew something terrible was coming, something no one could stop. Imagine being Tracy Reiner in that moment, receiving a call from your father, sensing his fear, his insistence. How do you process the weight of that instruction? How do you reconcile the son you've known all your life with the dark possibility your father fears most? And yet, Tracy would soon find herself at the center of a nightmare, forced to navigate grief, shock, and the unbearable realization that the man who had warned her might have been right. How do you protect yourself, your family, and your inheritance when the threat comes from the very person you once trusted most? The story of the Reiners is one that unspools like a thriller, each revelation more harrowing than the last. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, was the one to discover the bodies. Imagine the horror of that moment, the shock, the disbelief, the impossible task of processing the scene before her eyes. She told police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect, pointing toward the terrifying possibility that this was not a random act of violence, but a tragedy born of internal family conflict. The questions that arise are almost unbearable. How did it come to this? Were there warning signs ignored for too long? Could anyone have prevented this? And in the shadow of grief, the surviving family members were left not only to mourn, but to confront the unimaginable reality that their world had been irreparably shattered from within. But why does this story resonate so deeply now? It's not just because of the fame attached to the Reiner name, or the staggering wealth and influence they wielded. It's because it is, at its core, a story about family, the trust, love, and vulnerability that comes with it. Everyone watching this video has a family, someone they love and trust. And the idea that betrayal, danger, or tragedy can come from the very people closest to you is terrifying. It makes us ask uncomfortable questions about our own lives. How well do we know our loved ones? How vigilant are we when it comes to warning signs? What happens when love intersects with fear and protection is no longer enough? The public reaction to the Reiner tragedy was swift and emotional. Hollywood mourned. Fans expressed disbelief and sorrow on social media. Celebrities who had worked alongside Rob Reiner for decades were left grappling with grief and shock. There were mentions of prior concerns about Nick, stories of estrangement, and the hints of trouble that no one fully understood until it was too late. The media coverage, while sensational, couldn't capture the raw, human element, the fear, the warnings, the last conversations that now carry so much meaning. Every statement, every interview, every news article contributed to the growing puzzle. Why did this happen? And could it have been prevented? And at the heart of it all was a daughter holding onto the last words her father ever spoke. Words meant to protect, to guide, and to warn. This video will take you deep inside the Reiner family, revealing what happened in the days leading up to the tragedy, the final phone call, and the shocking truths that emerged afterward. We will examine the warning signs that were ignored, the relationships that frayed under the pressure of unspoken tensions, and the legacy that now hangs in the balance. You will hear about Nick Reiner's life, his interactions with his family, and the moments that hinted at the darkness lurking beneath the surface. We will explore how Tracy and Romy navigated the aftermath, the legal complexities, and the emotional turmoil of losing both parents in such a violent and unexpected way. And we will uncover the human lessons buried within this devastating story: trust, vigilance, love, and the fragility of even the most seemingly perfect family. But perhaps most compelling is the final message, the last call from Rob to Tracy. What does it mean to inherit a warning from someone you love? How do you act on it when the very person you are warned about is someone you once held dear? The weight of those words is almost unbearable to consider, and yet they form the emotional spine of this tragedy. They are the thread that connects every event, every revelation, and every heartbreak that follows. They are a stark reminder that even in wealth, fame, and comfort, vulnerability exists. And when that vulnerability is exploited by someone you thought you knew, the consequences can be catastrophic. As we dive into this story, remember that this is more than just a true crime tale. It is an exploration of family dynamics pushed to the extreme, a study in human psychology, and a look at the fragility of trust. It is about warning signs that go unheeded, the burden of knowledge, and the moral and emotional responsibilities we bear toward those we love. And above all, it is about the chilling reality that sometimes the people we think we know best can surprise us in ways we never imagined. But what Tracy did next, how she responded to her father's final warning, and the decisions that would shape the aftermath, are stories that cannot be ignored. They set the stage for a sequence of events that will shock you, move you, and leave you questioning the true meaning of family, loyalty, and love. In the next chapter, we will uncover the Reiner legacy, the public life, the private reality, and the hidden tensions that no one saw coming. And what comes next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it's like to live inside a family that the world admires, envies, and looks up to, yet harbors secrets no one could imagine? That was the Reiner family. To the public, they were Hollywood royalty. Rob Reiner, a filmmaker whose name alone could sell tickets, a visionary behind some of the most iconic movies in American cinema. Michelle Reiner, his elegant and devoted wife, a stabilizing presence behind the scenes. And their children, Tracy, Romy, and Nick, seemingly growing up in a world of privilege, creativity, and opportunity. But as glamorous as the Reiners appeared, there was a tension simmering beneath the surface, one that no award, red carpet, or Hollywood accolade could mask. Rob Reiner's career is the stuff of legend. From acting in All in the Family as Michael Meathead Stivic to directing classics like This Is Spinal Tap, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men, his influence is undeniable. He had charisma, humor, and an uncanny ability to connect with audiences. But what most people didn't see was the man behind the camera. The father who worried, who cared deeply about his children, and who, in his final days, carried a gnawing fear that something terrible was looming over his family. Michelle Reiner, though less in the spotlight, was a powerhouse in her own right. A private woman, she managed the family's domestic world with grace and dedication, ensuring that the household ran smoothly despite the pressures of fame, wealth, and public scrutiny. Her relationship with Rob was long-standing, complex, and deeply loving. But even in that partnership, the cracks of tension could appear when family dynamics grew complicated. Then there were the children. Tracy Reiner, a daughter who followed in her father's footsteps, both professionally and personally, learning from his guidance and sharing his ambitions. Romy, the youngest, more removed from the Hollywood limelight but equally affected by the family dynamics, and Nick, the son whose presence would later cast a shadow over the family legacy. Each child carried their own dreams, struggles, and, unbeknownst to the public, hidden behaviors that would eventually intersect in the most devastating way. The Reiners' Brentwood estate was a symbol of success, sprawling, elegant, and perfectly suited for a family accustomed to Hollywood attention. But estates like this, as beautiful as they are, can also become isolating. Privacy comes at a cost, and for the Reiners, it meant that behaviors and tensions that might have been observed in a smaller, more communal setting went unnoticed or were ignored until it was far too late. Even in a family as famous as the Reiners, human emotions do not disappear. Love, envy, resentment, and fear are universal. Rob and Michelle were aware of these dynamics, and Rob, in particular, was sensitive to the psychological nuances in his children. He tried, in his own way, to prepare them, guide them, and warn them when he sensed danger. The final words he would leave Tracy are evidence of that awareness. He knew that family, no matter how loving, could also be complicated and sometimes dangerous. For decades, the Reiners maintained a public image of perfection. Hollywood parties, movie premieres, charity events, they appeared united, harmonious, untouchable. Fans admired them, colleagues respected them, and the media adored them. But behind the curtain, subtle warning signs were emerging. Nick's behavior had caused concern before, whispered about by friends, neighbors, and even some family members. There were hints of obsession, of darkness, of detachment from reality. Small incidents that might have seemed trivial in isolation began to form a pattern, one that would later prove catastrophic. At the heart of it all, Rob Reiner remained a devoted father. He wasn't blind to the dangers. He simply hoped he could guide his children through them. But the weight of being a parent is heavy, especially when fame and wealth complicate relationships. Rob's concern for Tracy, his insistence that she follow his instructions about Nick, wasn't overprotectiveness. It was a father's intuition, a gut feeling honed by decades of experience and deep love. He understood that words could carry power, that instructions could be more than guidance. They could be protection, even in a family torn by unseen tensions. And yet, despite Rob's vigilance, the tragedy occurred. The Reiner family, as admired and envied as they were, could not escape the realities of human nature: fear, betrayal, anger, and darkness. The estate that had been a sanctuary became a scene of horror. The people who seemed closest to the Reiners, the very ones entrusted with love and trust, became part of the nightmare that would shatter their world forever. It's easy to look at the Reiners and think, they had everything: money, fame, influence. How could this happen to them? But the truth is, tragedy does not discriminate. It finds its way even into the most gilded lives, and sometimes it comes from within, from those we expect to love us most. Understanding the Reiner legacy requires more than just a glance at fame or wealth. It requires delving into the intricacies of family dynamics, into the subtle cues and unspoken tensions that ultimately set the stage for disaster. As we move forward into the story, you'll begin to see the cracks that were hidden behind public appearances. You'll understand how warning signs were missed, how behaviors that seemed small at first escalated into something dangerous, and how Rob Reiner's instincts and final words were both a lifeline and a harbinger of the unimaginable events that followed. Every chapter, every revelation, will pull you deeper into a family saga that reads like fiction but is, tragically, all too real. But even as we explore the Reiner legacy, the accomplishments, the glamour, the apparent perfection, one question hangs over the entire narrative. How did a family, so seemingly bound by love and success, unravel in a way that no one could foresee? And more importantly, what could have been done differently? The answers lie in the moments, the choices, and the warnings that were spoken but perhaps not fully heard. The story of the Reiners is just beginning. And the next chapter, the story of Nick Reiner, the shadow in the guest house, will reveal just how close darkness can creep into even the most illustrious families. What comes next is shocking, disturbing, and impossible to ignore. And what you'll learn about Nick will make you question everything you think you know about the Reiners, about family, and about the fragile line between love and fear. Not every child grows up the way you hope. Some follow the path you imagine, fulfilling dreams, sharing love, and carrying forward the legacy of their parents. Others take a darker turn. Nick Reiner, the youngest son of Rob and Michelle, would become the central figure in a family tragedy so shocking that it seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the childhood memories of a boy playing in the Brentwood estate gardens. But the truth is, Nick's story had warning signs from early on, small, unsettling behaviors that went unnoticed, dismissed, or misunderstood by those around him. Nick was 32 at the time of the tragedy, living in the guest house on the Reiner property. The same property that his parents had believed was a safe haven became the stage for a horrifying crime. Neighbors described Nick as quiet, sometimes reclusive, and occasionally erratic. Friends spoke of his obsessive tendencies, his strange behaviors that hinted at deeper psychological issues. The public didn't know him, and even within the family, some aspects of his personality were hidden behind a veil of charm, defensiveness, or denial. From childhood, Nick's interactions with his family were complicated. Tracy and Romy recalled moments when his moods seemed unpredictable, when his responses to ordinary family dynamics felt exaggerated or extreme. Rob, ever the observant father, noticed patterns that worried him. Moments of intense anger, episodes of self-isolation, and behaviors that suggested a fixation on certain subjects or objects. These were not the hallmarks of a typical teenage rebellion. They were warning signs, subtle yet undeniable, that something was not right. As Nick grew older, his behavior reportedly became more intense. Friends noticed that he spoke to himself at times, often muttering in the dark, and carried objects that made them uneasy. These were not casual habits. They were actions that hinted at inner turmoil, obsession, and perhaps a disconnect from reality. Rob Reiner, knowing his son better than anyone, tried to intervene, to guide him, to protect him from the consequences of his own impulses. Yet there was a limit to how much one could control the trajectory of another person's life, no matter how loving or vigilant. What made the situation even more complex was the family's attempt to balance normalcy with concern. Rob and Michelle didn't want to isolate Nick or stigmatize him, but they also couldn't ignore the danger that his behavior seemed to portend. This tension created a fragile equilibrium, one that could be shattered by a single event, a single misstep, or a single moment of anger. Neighbors reported unusual occurrences at the guest house. Strange noises late at night, lights flickering in ways that suggested more than just electrical issues. Nick's comings and goings were erratic, sometimes leaving friends puzzled and concerned. Some wondered if he was dealing with mental health issues. Others speculated about deeper, darker problems. And in hindsight, every small incident that seemed inconsequential was a piece of a puzzle that would eventually reveal the unimaginable. Rob Reiner, deeply concerned for his son, confided in friends, colleagues, and family members about his worries. He spoke in hushed tones about the intensity of Nick's behavior, about the obsessive tendencies he had noticed, and about the fear that something could go horribly wrong if intervention wasn't taken. It's chilling to think that even with Rob's influence, wisdom, and foresight, the situation escalated beyond his control. There were moments when Nick seemed normal, even charming, which made the darker tendencies even more difficult to detect. This duality between outward normalcy and hidden instability is one of the most disturbing aspects of the story. How do you reconcile the child you loved, the son you nurtured, with the potential for something violent and destructive lurking beneath the surface? How do you prepare when the threat comes from within your own home? These were questions Rob Reiner wrestled with, questions that ultimately informed the final words he spoke to Tracy. The night of the tragedy, the culmination of years of tension, fear, and unaddressed warning signs, revealed just how close danger had been. Nick's actions were not random. They were the manifestation of patterns that had been developing over decades. The guest house, which had seemed like a separate, safe space, became the epicenter of horror. Friends, neighbors, and even family members would later describe the scene as unimaginable, a stark contrast to the life they had known just moments before. Nick's life prior to the tragedy was not completely devoid of light. There were achievements, moments of affection, and glimpses of potential. But those were overshadowed by a pattern of behavior that grew increasingly concerning as he aged. His relationship with his parents, particularly Rob, was fraught with complexity, love intertwined with fear, hope entangled with worry. Rob's attempts to guide Nick, to prevent disaster, culminated in a final warning to Tracy. A warning born from an understanding of the danger Nick posed. It is tempting to ask, in stories like this, whether things could have been different. Could intervention have changed the outcome? Could more aggressive action, therapy, or confrontation have prevented the tragedy? There are no simple answers, only the haunting recognition that human behavior, no matter how well understood, can be unpredictable and sometimes deadly. Nick Reiner, the shadow in the guest house, represents the unknown, the danger that hides in plain sight. His story is a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that even within families who seem perfect, darkness can creep in quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And on that fateful night, it did. But the story of Nick cannot be told in isolation. It intersects with the lives of those around him, particularly his sisters, Tracy and Romy, and his parents, whose love and concern were profound but ultimately insufficient to stop the horror. The next chapter, focusing on Tracy Reiner and her bond with her father, will reveal the emotional stakes of Rob's final call, how his warning to her was more than just words, but a desperate attempt to prevent the unthinkable. Every daughter knows her father's voice. That tone, that warmth, that unmistakable cadence, it carries love, guidance, and sometimes a quiet urgency that lingers long after the conversation ends. For Tracy Reiner, that voice became the lifeline she never realized she would need. Her father, Rob Reiner, was more than a Hollywood legend. To Tracy, he was a protector, a mentor, and the man whose love was steady, unwavering, and sometimes frighteningly perceptive. Tracy and Rob shared a bond that went beyond the usual father-daughter relationship. From an early age, he nurtured her curiosity, encouraged her ambitions, and shared the lessons he had learned from decades in an industry that is as ruthless as it is glamorous. They would spend hours discussing life, art, and the nuances of human behavior. Tracy admired his intellect, his insight, and his ability to see patterns in people that others missed. But as she grew older, she also became aware of a side of her father that most people never saw, the side that worried constantly about the safety and well-being of his family. That concern became tragically significant in the days leading up to Rob's death. In the weeks before the tragedy, Rob had become increasingly worried about his son, Nick. He confided in Tracy during one of their last phone calls, a conversation that would become hauntingly prescient. "If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me?" he said. The words were spoken with a weight that could not be ignored. Tracy, hearing the urgency in her father's voice, understood immediately that this was no ordinary instruction. It was a warning, a final attempt to protect the family from a danger that Rob feared might be unavoidable. Imagine the pressure Tracy must have felt. Not only was she absorbing the grief of realizing her father feared her own brother, but she was also being tasked with a responsibility that could have significant legal, emotional, and familial consequences. How does one prepare for such a burden? How do you make decisions that could affect the safety and legacy of your family when the threat comes from someone you once loved unconditionally? These questions would dominate her thoughts in the days following Rob's call, and they would weigh on her heavily in the weeks after the tragedy. The depth of Tracy's relationship with her father is crucial to understanding the impact of his final words. Rob wasn't just concerned about the financial aspects of inheritance. He was aware of Nick's increasingly erratic behavior, his obsessive tendencies, and the risk he posed to the family. Tracy, as the recipient of her father's warning, became the custodian of both his trust and his fear. She carried the responsibility of acting on that warning, a responsibility that no one should ever have to bear, let alone in the aftermath of a violent family tragedy. Their bond had been built over years of shared experiences, laughter, arguments, and lessons learned. Tracy had seen her father at his best and at his most vulnerable. She knew his voice could convey more than words alone. In that last call, she could hear the tension, the fear, and the urgency. Rob's plea was not just about money. It was about ensuring the family's safety, preserving the legacy he had spent a lifetime building, and perhaps most importantly, protecting the people he loved from harm. The emotional weight of that phone call cannot be overstated. Many of us have heard warnings from loved ones, hints of concern that we might dismiss as caution or overprotectiveness. But in this case, the warning was both precise and ominous. Rob Reiner knew something was deeply wrong, and he trusted Tracy to act in accordance with his knowledge. That trust was both a gift and a burden, and Tracy would soon find herself navigating the impossible terrain of grief, responsibility, and fear. Even before the tragedy, Tracy's life had been influenced by her father's guidance. She had inherited not only his creative talents, but also his insight into human nature. Rob had taught her to pay attention to small details, to read behavior carefully, and to trust her instincts. Those lessons would become invaluable in the aftermath of the tragedy, as Tracy had to confront the reality of her father's fears and make decisions that could have lasting consequences for the family. But the bond between father and daughter was not just about instruction and guidance. It was also about emotional support, shared understanding, and mutual respect. Rob Reiner, despite his public persona, was a man deeply attuned to the needs of his children. He knew that Tracy had the strength, the intelligence, and the judgment to handle difficult situations, perhaps more than anyone else in the family. His final call was not just a warning. It was a testament to his faith in her, his belief that she could protect what he valued most. This bond would soon be tested in ways that no parent or child should ever face. When tragedy struck, Tracy was forced to navigate not only the grief of losing her father and mother, but also the chilling realization that the threat Rob had feared had come from within their own family. She had to confront the possibility that Nick, her own brother, was responsible for the deaths of their parents. The emotional and psychological toll of that realization is almost unimaginable. How do you process love, trust, and betrayal all at once? How do you reconcile the memory of childhood innocence with the horrifying reality of adult violence? As we move into the next chapter, we will meet Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, whose discovery of the bodies would set off a chain of events that would bring police, media, and the public into the Reiner family's private tragedy. Romy's role as the unexpected witness would add another layer of complexity and horror to the story, revealing the full scope of the family dynamics that had quietly festered for years. And what Romy encountered that day, in that house that had once symbolized safety and love, would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family. Some moments in life are so shattering that they sear themselves into memory forever. For Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter of Rob and Michelle, one such moment came on a Sunday that would alter the course of her life forever. She walked into a scene that no one should ever have to face. Her parents, stabbed to death, the home that had been a sanctuary now a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Romy's discovery was the first crack in the facade of the Reiner family, exposing a darkness that had been simmering quietly behind the walls of their Brentwood estate. Romy, at 27, was the daughter who had been slightly more removed from the public eye. Unlike Tracy, who had worked closely with Rob and had some experience navigating Hollywood's glare, Romy had largely maintained a private life. She was aware of family tensions, of Nick's odd behaviors, and of the subtle frictions that occasionally surfaced, but nothing could have prepared her for that morning. When she stepped into the house, she encountered not just loss, but betrayal. A reality so stark that it seemed almost unreal. According to reports, Romy immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. Her first instinct was shock, followed by a swift recognition that this was no accident. She informed the authorities that there was a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. The courage it took to speak those words in the midst of her grief cannot be overstated. Romy was thrust into a dual role: grieving daughter and key witness, tasked with navigating the complexities of law enforcement, media attention, and her own traumatic emotional state. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. Most of us, if faced with a crisis of any magnitude, rely on guidance, context, and support. Romy had none of that. She had to process the horror of losing both parents, the betrayal by a sibling, and the immediate responsibility to provide authorities with accurate, actionable information. In those initial hours, she was not only confronting grief but also the practical necessity of truth-telling, a task made all the more difficult by the emotional chaos swirling around her. Romy's relationship with Nick had always been complicated. As the youngest, she often observed the dynamics between her older siblings and their parents from a distance, sometimes feeling powerless to intervene. But in that moment, she became central to the unfolding investigation. Her insights, recollections, and instincts were invaluable to law enforcement as they began piecing together the events leading up to the tragedy. She provided details about Nick's behavior, his tendencies, and the subtle signs that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. Without Romy's testimony, understanding the context of the crime would have been far more challenging. Yet, even as she cooperated with police, Romy was navigating the trauma of an impossible reality. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had transformed into a scene of horror. Every corner, every room, every familiar object now carried echoes of violence and fear. The psychological impact of such an environment cannot be overstated. Romy's experience was not just about witnessing a crime. It was about reconciling the life she had known with the new, terrifying reality that her family had been irrevocably changed from within. The role of Romy as the unexpected witness also reveals a broader truth about human behavior in crisis. In situations of extreme stress, people react in ways that are unpredictable, often driven by instinct rather than logic. Romy's instinct was to alert authorities and provide clarity. She became a stabilizing force amidst chaos, a conduit for justice in a world suddenly defined by violence. Her courage, quick thinking, and composure in the midst of trauma illustrate the remarkable resilience that can emerge in moments of profound crisis. But Romy's journey was not just about her immediate reaction. In the days and weeks following the tragedy, she would confront an emotional labyrinth, navigating grief, fear, anger, and disbelief. She had to process the betrayal of a sibling, the irrevocable loss of her parents, and the public scrutiny that came with being part of one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent Hollywood history. Every interaction, every decision, every memory of that day would be colored by trauma, shaping not only her understanding of the events, but also her path forward. The discovery by Romy also highlights a chilling aspect of the tragedy, the way danger can lurk close to home. It is one thing to fear strangers, to worry about unknown threats in the world, but quite another to confront the possibility that the threat is embedded within your own family. Romy's role forced her to face this uncomfortable truth head-on. She became the lens through which the police, media, and eventually the public began to understand the horrifying events that had transpired. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the night of the tragedy itself, constructing a timeline that captures the escalating tension, the final moments of Rob and Michelle, and the actions that led to the ultimate confrontation. The night of horror was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of tension, warning signs, and unaddressed behaviors that had quietly escalated behind the walls of the Reiner estate. And what happened during that night will challenge everything you thought you knew about family, trust, and the fragility of safety, leaving a question that haunts the entire story. Could this tragedy have been prevented, or was it always inevitable? Some nights are ordinary, quiet, and predictable, but others become etched into memory forever, not for what was expected, but for the chaos that shatters normalcy in an instant. The night of the Reiner tragedy was one such night, a night that transformed a Brentwood estate from a home into a scene of unimaginable horror. It is the night that would leave the world asking, how could this happen, and why did no one see it coming? It began, as many tragedies do, with ordinary routines. Rob and Michelle Reiner were home, perhaps enjoying an evening together after a day filled with small tasks and familial interactions. The estate, expansive and elegant, would have appeared serene, even to neighbors who occasionally glimpsed life behind the gates. But behind that calm, the tension that had been building for years was quietly reaching a breaking point. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house on the property, had reportedly exhibited behaviors in the hours leading up to the tragedy that hinted at the storm to come. Though he had often seemed reclusive, strange, and obsessive, the culmination of his actions on that night would have terrifying finality. Reports suggest an escalation in erratic behavior, an intensity that may have been noticed only by those closest to him. Yet no one could have predicted the fatal outcome that awaited the family that evening. The sequence of events, as reconstructed by police and witnesses, is chilling in its simplicity. One moment, the Reiner estate was a home, familiar and safe. The next, it became a crime scene that would shock Hollywood and the world. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed, their lives ended violently in a house meant to shelter and protect. The brutality of the act, combined with the location, so intimately tied to family and safety, makes the tragedy especially harrowing. Romy Reiner, arriving on the scene shortly afterward, provides the first eyewitness account of the aftermath. Her discovery of her parents' bodies was not just a moment of grief, but an immediate confrontation with horror. She recognized the danger that Rob had feared, identifying Nick as a potential suspect. In those initial moments, Romy's instincts were critical. She provided authorities with vital information, guiding the initial phase of the investigation and helping law enforcement begin to unravel what had occurred. The Night of Horror also forces us to confront the terrifying reality that violence can erupt from those we trust most. Nick, the son of the household, became both the suspect and the embodiment of a fear that Rob had sensed for years. The juxtaposition of familial love with lethal danger creates a psychological complexity that is difficult to process. How can one reconcile the image of a child you raised with the actions that destroy the very people who gave them life? Every detail of that night matters, from the quietude of the estate to the shocking rupture of violence. Even the small, seemingly mundane elements, the layout of the house, the separation of the guest house, the timing of events, contribute to a story that is both heartbreaking and perplexing. It is a night that demonstrates how carefully contained tensions, when left unaddressed, can explode with devastating consequences. The investigation following the discovery revealed critical insights. Police began examining the timeline, the behaviors leading up to the event, and the mental state of the suspect. Evidence suggested that the act was not random, but rather the culmination of long-standing tensions and escalating behaviors. Friends and neighbors would later describe a sense of foreboding, moments where Nick's intensity seemed to hint at something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But what makes the Night of Horror so compelling and terrifying is the human element. It is not just the crime itself, but the intersecting emotions: Rob's fear, Michelle's vulnerability, Tracy's impending grief, Romy's immediate shock, and the inner chaos of Nick. Each individual's experience contributes to a tapestry of fear, suspense, and ultimate tragedy. This is what separates this story from ordinary crime reporting. It is a study in human psychology under extreme conditions, a cautionary tale of what can happen when warning signs are present but unheeded. Even in the aftermath, questions remain. Could Rob and Michelle have done anything differently? Could intervention have prevented the escalation? And most hauntingly, how do surviving family members process the knowledge that the danger came from someone they once trusted implicitly? These questions are not abstract. They are the psychological undercurrents that would guide Tracy and Romy in the days and months to follow, shaping both their personal lives and the legal aftermath of the tragedy. The Night of Horror marks a pivotal turning point in the Reiner story. Up until this moment, the narrative had been one of subtle tension, psychological unease, and familial concern. Now, it transformed into an irrevocable reality of death, betrayal, and grief. The ordinary routines of the household, dinners, conversations, laughter, were replaced by chaos, investigation, and trauma. And while the physical act of violence ended in that moment, the emotional, legal, and public consequences would reverberate for years. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the hidden family secrets that were exposed by this tragedy. The Night of Horror did more than take lives. It revealed patterns of behavior, unresolved tensions, and unspoken conflicts that had quietly shaped the Reiner family for decades. What had been private, personal, and hidden behind a facade of normalcy was now on full display, and the world would begin to see the complexity, the pain, and the tragedy that lay at the heart of one of Hollywood's most shocking family stories. And what comes next? The secrets that were uncovered, the betrayals that had been long simmering and the revelations about what really happened would shock even those who knew the family best. Every family has its secrets. Some are harmless, old anecdotes, forgotten arguments, childhood pranks. Others, however, are darker, heavier, and capable of shaping the destiny of everyone involved. In the case of the Reiners, the tragedy that unfolded in their Brentwood estate pulled back the veil on a series of hidden tensions, simmering conflicts, and dangerous dynamics that had long been ignored or underestimated. The night of horror wasn't an isolated incident. It was the eruption of years of secrecy, fear, and unresolved issues. To understand the depth of these secrets, we need to look beyond the public persona of the Reiners. Rob Reiner was a Hollywood icon, known for his charm, wit, and creative genius. Michelle, his wife, was admired for her elegance and steadfast dedication to the family. Together, they cultivated an image of success, love, and stability. But appearances, as they often do, masked a more complicated reality. One of the most significant secrets lay in the dynamics surrounding Nick Reiner. His increasingly erratic behavior had been observed by both parents and some close friends, but it was often downplayed or rationalized. Obsessive tendencies, nighttime mutterings, and a volatile temper were dismissed as quirks, eccentricities, or phases that would pass. Yet these behaviors were indicators of a deeper psychological struggle, one that was quietly destabilizing the family from within. Financial tensions also played a role. The Reiners' wealth, while a symbol of success, became a source of conflict and anxiety. Rob's final warning to Tracy, that Nick should not inherit a dime, was a stark acknowledgement that material assets could become instruments of harm if placed in the wrong hands. For Rob, it wasn't greed he feared, it was the potential consequences of giving control to someone he believed could act destructively. There were also relational secrets. Underlying strains between siblings, differences in perception, and unspoken resentments. Tracy, as the daughter closest to Rob, understood the warning signs her father had observed. Romy, while younger and more removed from day-to-day family dynamics, was still aware of the tension in certain interactions. Nick's isolation, the intensity of his obsessions, and the way he navigated family life were patterns that those closest to him could sense, yet no one fully confronted. The tragedy illuminated another hidden truth. The Reiners had tried to balance love with caution. Rob's approach was protective, yet non-confrontational. He encouraged, advised, and observed, but he also hoped that his guidance alone would be enough to steer Nick away from danger. It's a difficult line to walk, between enabling a family member's independence and protecting others from potential harm. In retrospect, the failure to fully address these tensions head-on may have contributed to the eventual catastrophe. Friends and neighbors later revealed glimpses into the private life of the Reiners that suggested cracks in the facade. Small incidents, unusual behaviors, and subtle arguments hinted at underlying problems. Yet in public, the family remained polished, composed, and seemingly invulnerable. The juxtaposition between public image and private reality created a tension that, once the tragedy struck, became impossible to ignore. There were also personal secrets, moments of vulnerability, fear, and unspoken doubts that Rob and Michelle carried with them. They had raised children in the glare of fame, with all the pressures that accompany wealth, social expectations, and the spotlight. Behind closed doors, they confronted challenges that few outside the family could understand. The delicate balancing act of guiding a son whose behavior was unpredictable while maintaining stability for their daughters. These challenges, private yet consequential, shaped the environment in which the tragedy eventually unfolded. In uncovering the family secrets, a pattern emerges: communication gaps, misinterpreted behaviors, and the heavy weight of unspoken fears. Rob's warnings to Tracy, which might have seemed extreme to an outsider, were the culmination of years of observation and concern. Every action, every quirk, every moment of tension built toward the inevitable confrontation that would define the family's fate. The night of horror forced these secrets into the open. The Reiners' world, once private and carefully curated, was now dissected in public records, police reports, and media coverage. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances began to piece together the behaviors, the warnings, and the choices that had led to the tragedy. Every revelation, every hidden detail, added layers of complexity to a story that, at first glance, seemed almost incomprehensible. The uncovering of family secrets also forces a deeper reflection. What does it mean when those closest to you harbor behaviors or tendencies that could harm others? How do love, loyalty, and familial duty intersect with fear and self-preservation? These are questions that the surviving Reiners, Tracy and Romy, would grapple with for the rest of their lives. The answers are neither simple nor comforting, but they are essential to understanding the magnitude of the tragedy. As we move into the next chapter, we will examine the reaction of Hollywood and the public. The Reiners were not just any family. They were a family whose lives intersected with fame, influence, and cultural significance. The shockwaves of the tragedy spread far beyond the Brentwood estate, as celebrities, colleagues, and fans alike tried to make sense of the unthinkable. And what the world saw in the aftermath would only begin to hint at the deep emotional and psychological toll this tragedy had inflicted, not only on the Reiner family, but on everyone who thought they understood the meaning of family, trust, and legacy. When news of the Reiner tragedy broke, the shock reverberated far beyond the gates of the Brentwood estate. Hollywood, a world accustomed to drama and intrigue, suddenly confronted a story that was disturbingly real, unbearably intimate, and impossible to ignore. For fans, colleagues, and celebrities alike, the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner shattered the illusion of untouchable fame. The glitz and glamour of Tinseltown collided with the raw, horrifying reality of a family destroyed from within. The immediate reactions were intense. Social media erupted with disbelief and sorrow. Fans shared memories of Rob's films, Michelle's quiet elegance, and the family moments that had been glimpsed through interviews and red carpet appearances. There were hashtags, candlelight vigils, and messages of condolences, but beneath the public mourning lay a deeper curiosity. A desperate need to understand how a family so revered, so seemingly perfect, could be torn apart by violence. Hollywood insiders were equally stunned. Colleagues who had worked with Rob Reiner over decades struggled to reconcile the legend they knew with the grim reports emerging from police statements. Directors, actors, and producers spoke in hushed tones, some expressing fear, others disbelief, but all grappling with the implications. For those who had interacted closely with the Reiners, the tragedy was not just a shocking news story, it was personal. It was a reminder that even those who appear larger than life are vulnerable to the same human frailties that affect everyone else. The media frenzy that followed was relentless. Every detail was dissected, from the timing of the crime to the family dynamics, the final phone call to Tracy, and Nick Reiner's history of erratic behavior. Pundits and true crime commentators speculated on motives, psychological profiles, and missed warning signs. Headlines were sensational, sometimes bordering on the morbid, but the underlying human story, the fear, grief, and betrayal experienced by Tracy and Romy, remained painfully real. Hollywood's reaction also highlighted the tension between public fascination and private grief. While fans and media were quick to analyze every detail, the surviving family members were forced to navigate their loss under intense scrutiny. Tracy, in particular, became the custodian of Rob's final instructions, balancing the desire for privacy with the reality that the world was watching. Romy, too, faced the impossible task of processing trauma while dealing with inquiries from authorities, journalists, and concerned acquaintances. The glare of fame amplified every emotion, every decision, and every moment of grief. Celebrities who had worked closely with Rob Reiner offered heartfelt tributes. Stories emerged of his generosity, mentorship, and warmth on set. Yet even as they remembered the father, director, and friend, many could not ignore the tragic circumstances of his death. The juxtaposition was jarring. The man who had brought joy, laughter, and insight to millions of audiences was gone, taken in a way that no script could have predicted. In the midst of this public reaction, a pattern emerged, a collective reckoning with the fragility of life, family, and trust. Hollywood, often obsessed with appearance and perception, was forced to confront a reality that fame cannot shield against: violence, betrayal, and tragedy can strike even in the most privileged and seemingly secure households. For those who admired Rob Reiner, the tragedy became more than a news story. It became a profound, almost existential reminder that no one is immune to human fragility. The public fascination also reflected something deeper. The horror of the familiar turned dangerous. Nick Reiner was not a stranger. He was the son, the brother, the family member. That reality struck a chord with audiences. It challenged assumptions about safety, trust, and the notion that family is inherently protective. The idea that the threat came from within made the story both compelling and deeply unsettling. Every viewer, every reader, was forced to ask themselves, what if danger lurks in places we least expect? As Hollywood grappled with the emotional shockwaves, legal proceedings quietly began. The arrest of Nick Reiner on charges of first-degree murder set the stage for one of the most watched, analyzed, and emotionally charged trials in recent memory. Every decision, every move, and every revelation would be dissected by lawyers, psychologists, and the public. The story of fame and tragedy had evolved into a complex legal and emotional drama, one that would test the resilience, courage, and wisdom of Tracy and Romy in ways they could never have imagined. But amid the shock and the headlines, one detail remained most haunting: the final phone call from Rob to Tracy. His warning, his plea, was no longer theoretical. It was reality. It underscored the depth of his foresight and the urgency of his love. And for Tracy and Romy, it became both a burden and a guiding light as they navigated the aftermath. The Hollywood shockwaves were only the beginning. As the public reacted, private lives unraveled, and hidden truths came to light. It became clear that the Reiner tragedy was not just a story of crime. It was a story of human complexity, vulnerability, and the tragic consequences when warning signs are ignored. In the next chapter, we will delve into the immediate investigation, the arrival of law enforcement, the gathering of evidence, and the painstaking reconstruction of a night of horror. This is where the puzzle pieces start to fit together, revealing how long-hidden behaviors and unaddressed family tensions culminated in a tragedy that no one could have fully prevented. And what investigators uncovered would shock even those closest to the family, exposing layers of complexity, fear, and foreboding that had been hiding in plain sight. When law enforcement arrived at the Brentwood estate, they stepped into a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner lay before them, a chilling testament to violence that had erupted behind the closed doors of a home that had once seemed safe. For the officers, detectives, and forensic teams, the task was monumental. Reconstruct a night that had ended in tragedy, identify the perpetrator, and uncover the motives that had led to such a devastating act. The first step was securing the scene. Every corner of the sprawling estate had to be meticulously examined. Investigators documented every detail, from blood spatter patterns to the placement of objects in the home, attempting to recreate the sequence of events that led to the fatal confrontation. This process was painstaking, requiring both technical precision and the psychological awareness to understand how the family dynamics may have contributed to the tragedy. Central to the investigation was Nick Reiner. He had been living in the guest house on the property, a separate space that provided him with a degree of isolation. While neighbors had noticed his sometimes erratic behavior, nothing they had observed prepared them, or the investigators, for what had occurred. Law enforcement officers focused on gathering evidence linking him to the crime, while also attempting to understand his mindset and the factors that may have led to the violent act. Romy Reiner's testimony was critical in the early stages. As the person who discovered the bodies, she provided details that helped investigators establish a timeline. Her account highlighted the tension between the family members, her awareness of prior concerns regarding Nick, and the immediate circumstances surrounding the discovery. Her observations were not just emotional. They were practical, providing actionable information that shaped the initial phase of the investigation. Meanwhile, Tracy Reiner was thrust into a position that few could imagine. She had been the recipient of Rob's final warning, and now she had to navigate the aftermath while cooperating with law enforcement. Her knowledge of her father's fears, his observations about Nick, and the family's internal dynamics became key elements in understanding both motive and context. Investigators recognized the value of her insights, knowing that the Reiners' private knowledge could provide crucial leads that would otherwise remain hidden. The evidence collected in the Brentwood estate painted a picture of escalating tension. Officers noted signs that the violence had been premeditated to some degree, though the emotional intensity of the act suggested an intersection of long-standing issues and immediate triggers. Forensic teams analyzed the crime scene, piecing together not only the physical evidence, but also the psychological underpinnings of the tragedy. Each observation, each detail, contributed to a broader understanding of how a family so prominent, so seemingly stable, could fall victim to internal violence. Neighbors and friends were interviewed, adding layers of context. Reports of Nick's obsessive tendencies, nocturnal mutterings, and previous conflicts with family members began to emerge. While some had seen these behaviors as quirks or eccentricities, the investigation framed them in a far more alarming light. Every small incident, when considered together, formed a mosaic of warning signs that had been largely ignored or misunderstood, culminating in the ultimate tragedy. Law enforcement also faced the challenge of managing the public narrative. With a high-profile family involved, the media scrutiny was intense. Rumors, speculation, and sensationalist reporting threatened to obscure the facts. Investigators had to balance transparency with the need to protect both the integrity of the case and the privacy of the surviving family members. Tracy and Romy found themselves navigating not only grief but also the glare of public attention, as the world sought answers and demanded accountability. Psychological experts were consulted to assess Nick's state of mind. His behaviors, history, and interactions with family were analyzed to understand potential motives and triggers. These insights would later become critical in the legal proceedings, helping to frame a narrative that explained the escalation of violence, while also highlighting the broader family dynamics that had contributed to the tragedy. As the investigation progressed, a pattern began to emerge. The convergence of long-standing familial tension, unaddressed mental health concerns, and immediate triggers that ultimately led to the violent outcome. The Reiner estate, once a place of love and safety, had become a focal point for understanding the consequences of hidden behaviors and ignored warning signs. But even as evidence mounted, questions remained. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Were there missed opportunities for intervention? And how much of what had occurred was a result of chance versus inevitability? These questions would shape both the investigation and the public discourse, as people tried to comprehend how such a revered family could experience such devastation. In the next chapter, we will explore the arrest of Nick Reiner, the charges brought against him, and the legal complexities that would follow. The investigation had provided clarity, but it also opened the door to new questions, ethical dilemmas, and emotional challenges that would test the resilience of Tracy and Romy as they faced not only their grief, but also the public scrutiny and legal realities of the case. And what the arrest revealed about Nick, his behavior, and the events leading up to the tragedy would shock even those closest to the family, exposing truths that had long been hidden behind a veneer of normalcy.